Welcome back. So we're on to the second stop I'm going to explore on the Underground Railroad. And this is at 2 White Street in what we now call Tribeca, New York. And first I need to clarify that for those who are not from the US, that the Underground Railroad was neither underground or was it a railroad. It was just a network of safe houses that escaped enslaved people could hide in. And the host of the safe house was called a conductor. Having covered that, let's move on to the themes I want to explore today is about returning to Africa or remaining in the US, and that's always been a popular discussion, or remain in the US or anywhere you are in the diaspora. But more pertinent in the next 4 years with the Orange King as our leader, some of us might be questioning, do we remain in the US under the kingship of the Orange King, or do we leave? But first, I'm going to introduce you to the conductor at 2 White Street, and his name is Theodore Segdewick Wright, and he lived between 1797 and 1847. He was beloved by his contemporary black people, but is not remembered in history like people such as Frederick Douglass. And some of that had to do, some people attributed that to the fact that he was born free and that he did not have experiential knowledge of enslavement. But rather than, for me, seeing that as a negative, I see that as a positive, because it's one thing fighting for something that you need. It's another thing altogether fighting for something that you don't need and someone else needs. It's like this is some high level love. So Theodore Wright was born free in Rhode Island in April 1797 to free parents, and he comes from a generation of generational pro-black activism. His father, R.P.G. Wright, actively opposed the Back to Africa colonization movement of the American Colonization Society. Their aim was to send free black people to Africa to gain a greater control over the slave system, because people like Theodore Wright, he was doing too much abolitionist activism, converting too many people, so they wanted to get the agitators out so they could gain more control. His father, the senior Wright, took a hard journey from Schenectady, New York, upstate New York, where he lived for a part of the time, to Philadelphia as a delegate to the famous Negro Convention of 1817. And showing the generational trend, it's Reverend Wright would then have to write about his father's experience, and this is what he wrote. This is the sentiments of the people who went to that convention. Before high heavens, in the presence of Almighty God, and in the midst of a persecuting nation, the U.S., resolved that they never would leave the land. They resolved to cling to their oppressed brethren. They felt that every ennobling spirit forbade them from leaving. They resolved to remain here, come what would, persecution or death. They determined to grapple themselves to their enslaved brethren as with hooks of steel. That imagery is so rich to me. It's like we came over here in chains, and they evoke that imagery, that you're the same way you took us over here in chains, that's the same way we're clinging to each other. We're not leaving each other while we're suffering. With a father like that, it's not hard to see how the son became the man he became. He was a militant abolitionist who wanted tangible actions and not just words, and most of his activity was between the 1830s and 1840s. And he believed that the U.S. Constitution was an anti-slavery document. And for me, in my reading, he had more faith in the goodness of the American people in terms of them wanting to live well with others than history would reveal. that they did. So he kept people in his house, enslaved runaway people in his house at 2 White Street. And near the end of this, you'll see pictures that I have there of that house. It's now a store. He was, again, shared his father's sentiments towards the Black to Africa movement. And his own words was that he wanted Black people to remain in the land their ancestors' blood enriched, and he wanted them to fight for their rights and liberties. We both went to, that's me and this person, Theodore, Wright. We went to Princeton Theological Seminary, but he was more prestigious. He was the first Black person to get a theological degree. He became a Presbyterian minister of the First Colored Presbyterian Church of New York City. He was known to be an excellent preacher, very diplomatic, something I'm not, had much success in converting slaveholders to abolitionists with his sermons, something I'll never try to do. He was vice president of the Phoenix Society, and he worked towards the improvement, the education, and the training of Black people. He was full of Black love. He fought for the voting rights in the form of the termination of the property requirements because he wanted more Black people to be able to vote. At the age of 40, which is now in 1837, he married Adeline Turpin of New Rochelle, New York, and he died 10 years later on March 25th, 1847, at the age of 50. So he had 50 years of life, but a life well lived. Despite his opposition to free people being sent back to Africa or sent to Africa, the American Colonization Society succeeded with the help from the federal government. About $100,000 that they would not give for reparation, they gave for these people to go, and they would form a colony that became known as Liberia. And what happens there is the Black people become known as America Liberians, and they had so internalized white supremacy and the Western gaze that they viewed the indigenous Africans not as equals, but inferior people in need of civilization and Christianization. Like, Africa is nearer to the Middle East than the US is. Like, you don't have to bring religion to them. They're right in the birthplace of all the religion, and clearly depicted in the Bible and most religious traditions, unlike the US. But what was really bothersome to me is how, as Black people, we still do it. Internalize white supremacy, to think that the people who stole our ancestors, killed our ancestors, committed genocide, oppressed us, lynched us, how do you see them as superior people instead of seeing them for the deeds that are done? Like, how do you not realize that in this story, the victims are the people worth emulating and not the people who harmed others? So let me get to the question. Should we go back to Africa or stay where our ancestors' blood built everything? The flag on this channel is from Garvey. And Garvey is a Pan-Africanist. He advocated for a return to Africa, but not with the Western gaze of seeking to colonize and Christianize them. He wanted us to go there because he viewed Africa as great and Africans as great. And personally, I don't think I get to make up your mind. I think you should do everything and anything you want, because that is the definition of freedom. Stay wherever you want, but don't allow anyone to run you out of your birth homes. And if you want to leave, wait for your reparation check, so when you get to where you're going, you can live large. But if you go to Africa, do not go there with the condescending Western gaze that views thieves and enslavers as the ideal humans. Rather, to remember, my definition of civilized is to live well within yourself, to live well with others, and to live well with the planet. White supremacy does not exemplify any of these principles. They do not live well within themselves, with others, or with the planet. So, in the next 4 years for me, I can leave, but I'm choosing not to. I'm going to cling, just like Reverend Wright said, I'm going to cling to my oppressed siblings in the US because love stays when you're at your lowest. Thanks for listening.